Hi, Olivier here. Are you curious to know what's going on with IoT at Microsoft? Well, I would like to know as well. And for that, I asked Lior. Lior is just out of Microsoft Ignite, and they announced Azure IoT Operations. We have an interesting conversation on the IoT show with Lior, discussing technology and how containers are coming into play. If you are in the realm of embedded, you will want to watch this video to better understand the evolutions and what's going on at Microsoft when it comes to IoT. Hi everyone, this is Olivier watching the IoT show. We have a familiar face here, Lior, and we'll be talking about IoT at Microsoft. Lior, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's post Ignite. I was waiting to catch up with you. It's been a long overdue.
Yeah, definitely. And we are exactly a week and something after Ignite, right? So you had a week off in between, so you survived Ignite. Thanks for joining me for that recording on that Thursday of the week after Ignite, something like that, right? So you survived. You're here, great. For those who are not aware and don't really know you yet, who's Lior? What are you doing?
It's a good question. I'm asking myself this every day. Every day when I wake up in the morning. Well, my name is Lior Kamrat. I work for I work as a principal product manager in the Edge and platform organization here at Microsoft, and my role is a bit weird. I'm everywhere, but I'm nowhere. The way I like to describe this, because a lot of my role is got to do with, on a given day, I can either talk to customers, or I can create content, or I can present, but I never develop the actual features of the products that I'm talking about. Been there, done that. I think that my role is a bit more horizontal in the past few years, and I kind of like it that way. It gives me that agility that I really like. So.
That sounds familiar, because my role when I was at Microsoft was the same, basically. And at the end of the day, I think at some point I was calling myself the dot connector or something like that, because lots of the time was about connecting dots between people, between programs as well, and so on. Anyways, we are going off here. Let's come back to the topic. So Ignite a couple of weeks ago, and there were some IoT announcements, right? But before we get into the IoT announcements, can you give us a very quick update of where Microsoft is standing when it comes to IoT in terms of the offer in general? It's like super high level.
A lot of people were asking me this when I was kind of going in the hallway because of what we're going to talk about, which is Azure IoT Operations. But before we go there, I mean, if you've been following that space of IoT, you know that we have like the existing offerings like IoT Edge, IoT Hub, Digital Twins. I know that you have, upcoming episodes on RTOS, and Windows IoT is definitely something that's been there for a while. There's also like beloved and almost rest in peace products like Sphere and whatnot, which we all have a warm place in our heart towards. But so this is in general, and now nothing has changed on that aspect, and now it's the new kid on the block, which is Azure IoT Operations.
Okay, well, let's get into that. So what was announced? Azure IoT Operations. What is that?
Yeah. So Azure IoT Operations is really, I find it very interesting. Besides the marketing spiel, which is a way to do data contextualization from IoT or from the edge to the cloud, in a general sense, and the way to go about this is by having this modular architecture of services, of components like OPC UA and MQ broker and orchestrator that decide how you want to deploy those elements inside your architecture, Acri, but besides which, again, we'll talk about all this stuff, right? And we can dive a bit deeper. But besides the marketing spiel, I think that if you're thinking about Azure IoT Operations, if you've been following the announcement and whatnot, I actually think that it's our evolution towards the world of simplifying or standardize how people are building cloud native architecture applications today, but try to apply that to edge related architectures. Because a lot of the time you don't, like, before that, or before Azure IoT Operations, the way that, and you know this as much as I do, where people are coming in to build these type of architectures for
Mhm.
edge deployments, right? Cloud native is not a thing, because everything is local. Everything is, you have the good old MQTT or the OPC architectures and all that, but it was never about cloud native, because cloud native a lot of the time comes in the context of containers or Kubernetes and
Mhm.
these type of related architecture. So Azure IoT Operations is really about bridging those worlds together, and the way to do that is having everything enabled by Azure Arc. So that's in a nutshell. But there's obviously more to unfold here. So
Yeah, we'll definitely double click on a couple things and aspects here. So
yeah,
the first question that everyone asked you at the event, I know that it came up, often, and you
yeah,
kind of alluded to that already. So this is about an offer that is leveraging and using Azure Arc as a control plane instead of IoT Hub, and it's using the MQTT broker in Event Grid instead of IoT Hub. And it's using Kubernetes cluster and technologies and Azure Arc as a control plane instead of IoT Hub plus IoT Edge. So
mhm,
at the end of the day, is it a replacement? What does that mean, regarding these, I would say, legacy or existing
yeah.
established technology that Microsoft is proposing?
Yeah, Olivier, if I had a nickel, the reason that I'm saying this is because this question comes a lot. So
Mhm.
as you are describing this, you can also see the pattern, right? You can see a pattern of old versus new. And the
Mhm.
reason that I'm air quoting this is because it's not really old versus new. It's really about, again, coming back to this evolution. So it's not a replacement, it's a complementary thing. It really depends on the architecture that you want to build. But like with all things in technology, there is evolution. There is existing patterns and existing architecture patterns. I talked about it a lot in my session, but there's also new architecture patterns that are
Mhm.
more, I would dare to say more suitable for the world that we are at right now. And it's not just for the world that we are at right now from the context of the pure technology, but also how people are designing this, like what is the how the developer teams are built, how the OT teams are built, or the IT operations teams to support those are being built, and everything's got kind of do together. I always said that it's all about people, it's not about the technology, because they're the one that driving those architectures.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Mhm.
coming back, I was just going to open in a branch here, coming back to your question. Yeah, it's a complementary thing, it's not a replacement. People were asking us this a lot, and I'll keep saying the same thing. No one is replacing anything.
Oh, and as a matter of fact, GA services on Azure, they're maintained X years, even
Right.
if they become deprecated at some point, there's a
Yep.
commitment from Microsoft to anyways maintain these services.
Yeah.
So for people who have deployed with these technologies, they shouldn't be worried about anything of the sort of like, hey, the service is going to be killed, whatnot. However, they should,
Yeah.
if they are starting a new version, a new product, or investigating how to evolve their products, they should
Mhm.
consider Azure IoT Operations in parallel, because we'll discuss that in a second. There are differences. There are things that they're not
Yep.
addressing exactly the same scenarios and market and level of function. So,
True.
like typically, being a guy coming from the embedded world,
Yeah.
when IoT Edge came into play 5-6 years ago, so maybe 7 years ago,
Mhm.
that's something that we brought
Don't say how
in
old we
IoT.
are. Well, don't say how old.
Sorry.
Don't say how old we are. Yes.
No, yeah, no, people know. Look at that. You know, we'll edit that. We have filters for that. But when we went out, and I was part of that team, we
Mhm.
released IoT Edge. I remember internally having conversations about, hey, why are you not using AKS already and things like that? And we're just like, hey, you know what? It's not ready. AKS Kubernetes was not where it is at today. And so we went with Docker with that idea of we needed to have on a heavier edge gateway/server type of devices on premises, a way
Uh-huh.
to orchestrate workloads. And at the time, Docker containers were the solution, where
Yeah.
what was available in production for building the solutions the customers wanted to have immediately. And so it seems natural to have AKS, Kubernetes, K3S, these kind of technologies that are now more mature come and take place, there. However, there's still requirements from the hardware perspective that are higher than IoT Edge was Docker containers. That was already big for embedded, but now we're getting in the place which it's a bit bigger. And my point here is to say, don't expect that Azure IoT Operations to be a replacement for IoT Edge. It's something that is not meant to go all the way down to microcontrollers for now. It's something that is about this heavier edge where you have AI, where you have more advanced functionality, right? So tell me a bit more about, like your perspective from the other side, which is coming from the world of containers and Arc and so on. In that evolution. Tell me more about your side of the story.
Yeah, so you touch on few important topics here. So let me try to break it down for a second, and I'll in no specific order. First of all, in the conversation around containers, for those who've been in the game for a while now, if you remember, Docker was not the first player to introduce containers. I mean, Docker, what they did is basically made it approachable, easy to consume. Some operational magic around containers, but in the world of containers, you had containers way before that, like LXD or Containerd, like that. Those were things that were way before Docker. So it's just kind of level set on this one. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the embedded world, which the background that you're coming from, can benefit out of this new world of just call it Kubernetes for lack of a better, kind of, I would say container orchestrators, right? And the reason that I'm saying this, just kind of before touching Azure Arc, the reason that I'm saying this is because when you're starting to create this relationship between physical devices and software in the sense of, oh, I now have a control plane that represent those embedded devices, right? Those cameras, those PLCs, those, microchips. When you have a control plane, an API layer that represent those, that's a different ballgame. Now, to be fair, IoT Edge did that, but not to the level that you actually had like this granular control or granular relationship between a device and Azure control plane. Sure, you have IoT Edge to manage those devices and have some policy and governance around those, but it stops there. Like it stops in the world of Azure IoT Edge, right? And you have MQTT and EventGrid and all those integrations. Fine. So that's one thing, and we would love to dive deeper into that in a second here. The second thing that you brought up is the Kubernetes, and again, I'll just kind of walk into memory lane. Before Kubernetes won the war, right, of container orchestrators, you actually had multiple players in that space, right? I remember when I started with Microsoft, I was actually working on Mesosphere, DCOS, before Kubernetes was the thing. Anyway, the reason that I'm saying this is because this is part of this evolution space. Now, Kubernetes won the war. And what we did with Azure Arc is basically saying, okay, so now that you have a standardization, like you have a standard way for people to do container orchestration, right? You have that in the cloud, right? You have AKS in Azure, you have Gkey in Google, ECS, like whatnot, whatever the hyperscaler that you're going with. But what about those clusters that are deployed outside of Azure? So with Azure Arc, you're able to bring those clusters as an entity, right? And that is basically the foundation for Azure IoT Operations, if you think about it, because those devices that we mentioned, the PLCs, the cameras, and whatnot, right? Now with Azure Arc and IoT Operations, right, enabled by the Azure Arc, that's the marketing term, right?
Yeah.
You are able to bring those devices and start imagine how they will look like as a first-class citizen inside Azure APIs. That brings an all different set of capabilities. And it doesn't stop just in the where Azure IoT Edge stops today. And that's a very different type of architecture. And to me, coming back full circle, the embedded world is meeting the, the cloud native world. Azure IoT Operations is really just kind of adds a lot of glue in that mix, and it focuses on the data pipeline, right? Because that really will drive the business. But it's the Arc piece to me that is, I wouldn't say even more interesting, but it presents a very different type of architecture to think about. So a long answer, but again, there's a lot to unfold in that space. There's a lot of architecture related, like hardcore conversations that got to do with the architectures around this type of stuff.
That's interesting that you are presenting it like that, because there was one thing that I think people have been struggling until now when it came to integrating OT and IT infrastructures and coding and so on, is that developers on the IT side of things were used to have, the tools that they are using for mobile app development, for cloud app development, for, cloud apps development in general. So they are the ones building these apps. And so we had to explain to them what is a device, how it's exposed through IoT Hub and the device twin. And hey, here's the JSON, and knock yourself out, right?
Right.
And eventually you are using some other PaaS services, whatnot. But at the end of the day, they pretty much have to figure it out, or it had to be done for them. And so now what you're saying is that these same devices are exposed to these developers in the way they're used to have microservices exposed to them. Entities. Let's use that term, entities, sources of data, and whatever. So now they are in their home, right? They're familiar with that, and so they can deal with that more easily. It does not prevent the use of technologies like Azure Digital Twins, where you can start having an organization with, topologies and think about ontologies, think about, relationship between these entities and so on. So you can definitely do that and organize into Digital Twin, and that would be another types of interface to your systems.
Yeah.
But for a developer who directly wants to access his, temperature data from that sensor, if they have an API that is familiar, that's going to be faster for them, right?
Exactly. And an interesting part of IoT operation in that regards is the data processor, right? Because the role of the data processor is to basically take various type of, I want to say, data endpoints or data structures or schemas, right? And converge those into something that is easy to consume. So if you're thinking about the pipeline here, which is kind of another construct of the data processor, right? The pipelines. If you're thinking about the source and then the pipeline and then the output at the end of the day will feed out of contextualized data, which the data processor is responsible to basically massage, right? So you have all these devices that are coming in, sending all these type of data on different schemas, but then you have one type of basically component that is responsible for massaging. And then from there, what you can do is you can use digital twins, you can use Fabric, you can use Power BI, you can use like whatever, whatever data output I want to say product or data layer that you wanna use, like one layer or like data lake, whatnot. So that's a very interesting piece. And one more thing, Olivier, here is just kind of maybe for the folks that maybe want to have some sort of an analogy. That, like the way I like to think about this is, then you mentioned the developers here, that it's really, so think about gRPC, right? gRPC is a very, it's a common protocol for microservices communication. But if you take in something like, so let's just say in your backend, you have something like Java or Golang or Rust or Python, right? Each one of those has its own library for, HTTP communication, right? But gRPC is used to standardize that. So that's a very good example, or I like to use that example as an analogy for what the data processor is doing for the various data inputs that are coming in. Everyone are using their own kind of data schema, but data processor is really the component that is contextualizing that data into something that you can digest.
Yep. So one more little topic before I let you go, and we point people to some more resources, is
Yeah.
that lots of the audience here on the IoT show is people coming from the embedded side of things. And so
Yeah.
when we came up with IoT Edge at Microsoft and was there, people were already like kind of reacting. It was like spending a lot of time explaining, hey, think of it as your gateway. That's your gateway to the cloud for this
Mhm.
infrastructure, which is your OT infrastructure, your devices that used to not be connected or to be in a silo there. And so here it's the same thing, even more so because like of the actual weight of Kubernetes, as an orchestrator, as a
Yeah.
binary, and the host platform you're going to be running on. So you should definitely think of AIO as something that, if you don't have a connected infrastructure, will add the connectivity and be that, like on a diagram would be a big box that you add there in between
Yeah.
your local infrastructure and the cloud. For people who already have like infrastructure, connectivity, and so on, still the same thing. Think of it as, from my perspective, and you tell me if I'm wrong, today you need to think of AIO as it's the solution that needs to have some beefy hardware on site, on premises, beefy to a certain extent for an embedded person, right?
Mhm.
It's not yet a story where a microcontroller will have its own cluster and will be able to run pods that you manage directly from Azure Arc. You
Right.
have to have an infrastructure a bit heavier on your premises. And each time we need to be careful about the word edge. Embedded people, when they hear edge, they think embedded devices.
Right.
This here is not about embedded. This is really about the edge in a more generic way, right?
Right. And this is more, like edge embedded. This is more of a philosophical conversation, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, yes, you're right. I mean, the architecture, the Azure IoT Operations architecture is based on Kubernetes at the end of the day. And the way you want to think about this is Kubernetes bring things to the architecture that you won't be able to get with a standardized point-to-point embedded architecture. It's just different. It's not the same thing. So
Mhm.
I would say, again, the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
Um, Azure IoT Operations act as really a pretty significant layer in between your, I want to say, embedded devices and the cloud.
Mhm.
Um, and by the way, not just between your embedded devices and the cloud, but also between your embedded devices to other edge architectures that are part of your enterprise, right?
Yeah.
So
Good
that's
point.
another important thing to say. I mean, no one is telling you that you have to go to the cloud. That's
Mhm.
not, that's not the point. The point here is for you to build an architecture that can scale and take advantage of the cloud, mainly from the data and I want to say governance point of view. Like, how do you govern those assets, and how
Yeah.
do you use that data in a contextualized fashion, and use Azure solutions to work with that
Yeah.
data. So yeah, it's just
That's
a different architecture. That's all.
that's definitely a good point, and it's going to be interesting to see. For now, it's in preview, but it's going to be enriched. You would expect, as a customer, I would expect to see things for device management, for this kind of things that are
Yes.
will be actually made even easier with that infrastructure in place. But that certainly is a topic for another episode. One thing we want to lead people to, especially for our audience on the IoT show, Azure
Mhm.
Arc and how they can learn about it in the context of IoT. So I'm going to bring that link down there about the Arc Jumpstart. Can you introduce the Jumpstart real quick so that people know where they're landing when they
Yeah,
click there?
yeah. If you're not coming from that space of Azure Arc, I would say that the Arc Jumpstart is really a project that been there for 4 years, almost 4 years. And at Ignite, we announced the productization of this project. So basically, now it's a full-fledged product in the sense that we have a team to support that. Like, it's a Microsoft thing. No, it doesn't cost any money to use, but it's basically a set of assets that you have, like automations, documentations that are more like scenario and solution based documentations and automations that we're providing. So it's complementary to docs,
Mhm.
but it's not necessarily a product documentation like you will see in docs. It basically focuses on the story. So the link that you have there on screen is the jumpstart scenario for the Azure IoT Operations development that we did, and it tells the story of Contoso Bakeries. And you can already see, like when I'm saying Contoso Bakeries, we're trying to simulate the customer here, and what are the things that they will, some of the things that they might encounter in the real world in their architecture that is based on Azure IoT Operations. So it's pretty interesting, and definitely go check that out, because we work very hard on that, and we take a lot of pride of those automations,
Yeah.
and we think that it's a great way for you to actually connect yourself to something that can happen in the real world.
I like that. I like that. I think that the content you put together makes sense, because for an audience to understand a technology that is not familiar at all, if it's set in the context of what they care about, what they're working on a daily basis, makes sense, and actually will make it way more useful, and they will see the value real quick into that. If it's for them, once again, I mean, that's something that they will have to investigate and see. Lior, thank you very much for your time today. We spent a lot of time geeking out on this topic, but I think it was worth the time. And I really hope to see you again on the IoT Show for a more deep dive on all of that.
Thanks so much for having me, Olivier. Always a pleasure.
Have a good one. And everyone, thanks for tuning in. Bye.